Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Dr. Stuart Phillips, a renowned expert in muscle health and aging and professor of kinesiology at McMaster University. Dr. Phillips has published hundreds of scientific articles which have been cited over 70,000 times. In our conversation, we discuss muscle health, protein, and longevity. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. Okay, let's dive in. Dr. Stuart Phillips, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ty.
Yeah, well, you're a leading expert on muscle health and aging, and I really appreciate your perspective because you are balanced and you're willing to change your mind whenever you uncover new evidence, which I think has probably happened throughout your illustrious career. Can you tell us a little bit how maybe your understanding of muscle health and protein has changed since you began this work?
Sure. I'd say that I started I'm trained as a biochemist. And so I looked at the inside of cells before I looked at anything that was resembling, a whole muscle or physiology. But when I did my master's and I sort of came into that in an accidental way, but just fell in love with research. And the first guy that I interacted with was a fellow named Mark Tornopolsky, and his whole world revolves around muscle. And he was trained as a kinesiologist, you would say these days, or an exercise physiologist. And he was the one who, basically said, well, it's all about muscle. And, I'd been an athlete and I thought, yeah, that resonates with me. Muscle was really important to me. Spent a lot of time lifting weights and everything. So that really sat well with me. I think the way things have changed is that, 20 plus years ago, I used to think that protein was, could do everything. It was the key part of gaining muscle and building muscle. And, now the realization is that actually exercise is definitely the key driver of muscle. It's building and it's retention as you get older. And as I get older, I'm more and more focused on that. Not that protein is unimportant, but I think that we and some others have sort of overstated its relative importance in the whole A, muscle mass gaining, and then B, prevention of loss. And not that it's, like I said, it's not unimportant, it's complete, non-issue, which some people would probably say is the case. But it appears that, and you and I were talking before we got on the show that it's become quite divided, right? It's actually low to no / protein, and or, sort of what I consider to be almost over the top recommendations. And so that middle ground is the scorched earth over which I tend to fight. I tend to fight with both people, actually, but I probably agree more than I disagree with just about everybody. So, which I think frustrates some people. But I think you can be decidedly moderate in this and still be, pretty much right.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think you do a good job conversing and discussing and working with people who maybe are on a little bit more of the extremes, and you always seem to look at the evidence and bring people down to, what does the evidence say? What could we agree upon, right? You're saying we probably agree about maybe 90% of this stuff anyways. So I'd really love to know, so you kind of hinted at this, but what are the most important ways to maintain muscle health, especially as we age?
Yeah, I mean, as we age, the phenomenon that Irv Rosenberg and Bill Evans but basically described as sarcopenia, which I think is a term that more people are becoming familiar with as sort of a mainstream term, which is, when it was first described, the loss of muscle mass, and it's now morphed into the loss of muscle strength, and then the loss of function and associated properties. So muscle power being a really important one. That's the key reason why, we talk about preservation of muscle mass as we age. And I think it's really been a bit of a renaissance in people's understanding about what it means to hang on to a tissue that's, clearly everybody gets that it's about locomotion. But I think that people maybe misunderstand the role that muscle plays as an intermediary. I call it tissue. It might not be a big player in metabolism, but because of its mass, it's the greatest site of, postprandial blood glucose disposal. It's a big contributor to your metabolic rate. And it's almost as if, and, to maybe simplify it, the more muscle you have and the less body fat that you have, the better things tend to go from a metabolic health perspective. And, I always point out to people that the top risk factor for just about every chronic disease, if not the top, is age, right? So all of these things tend to go wrong as we get older. And I'm not saying that muscle is in the middle, but it's definitely a much bigger part than we once thought. That's for sure.
So, thinking about strength and muscle mass, are they both equally important in different ways, or would you say that the key is really about the strength part of it or the
Yeah.
mass part of it?
Well, I mean, I think they go hand in hand. And as much as, people say, well, strength is proportional to mass, or it's generally the general sort of linear understanding is that the bigger muscle you have, the more strength. So this muscle can't generate as much as this muscle. And so, and the proof of that is just to look at bodybuilders and, power lifters and say, look how big their muscles are. And I get that, but I do think that, if you could go into your, the latter stages of your life with more muscle mass, it's sort of like it's like a buffer. I mean, muscle is, if you like, a reserve that you tap into in times of stress. And, the more you have going into that period of your life, probably the better off that you're going to do. But function can't be underestimated. And I'm pretty sure that with everything that I've seen to date, as you get older, something that you're going to do or want to do in your life that you probably can't do or struggle to do as you get older is related to, your ability to be strong, or more probably likely to be your ability to generate strength quickly. And that's power, right? So, the one everybody gets is like standing up and out of a chair, and they go, that's strength. I'm like, actually, it's much more power related than you think. And so, that quick move to take the step if you're out, you can't balance and you avoid a fall. Those are power related things. Moving across an intersection, while you've still got time on the light, are power related capabilities. So I think I want to say that the function of the tissue that you have is important, but I wouldn't discount having a good amount of the tissue either. So
Okay, so they're both important, and what you're saying also is in older age, it's this sort of explosive or maybe this quick ability to generate power that's really important for preventing falls, for being able to move in ways that would otherwise prevent us from being able to do basic functions, and our quality of life would suffer. Can you tell us about resistance training or strength training, and a little bit more into the details about which types are most critical for protecting, your power as well as
yeah,
your overall strength?
yeah, and I'll be honest, is that my realization around power has been sort of a gradual one, and it's sort of been hammered home for me more recently. And reading deeper into the literature, and so a lot of other people are out there going, "Oh, well, do you remember that time you said that strength was more important?" And I was like, "Yeah, you're probably right." So again, every day is a school day, right? So I'm learning. But before I talk about types of strength training and everything, I mean, I think one of the things I want to make clear is that when we look at self-reported engagement and in the act of strength training, which is still part of the everybody's sort of physical activity guidelines, doesn't matter what country, everybody gets the 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous, But there is also this sort of, it's almost a tagline, but I think it's kind of moving into more mainstream now. 2 days a week of strengthening activities. And there's still a bit of a confusion about what those are, but it's something where you're moving against a load that is sort of atypical for what you might do in your daily activities. So, but that could be your own body weight. It could be a weight that you pick up. It could be a resistance band. So there are lots of ways to do this, but the participation in those activities is ridiculously low. And I mean, it's a little bit like, in your world, you talk about who adheres to the dietary guidelines, and the answer is virtually nobody. But
Right.
so who adheres to the physical activity guidelines? And I'd say that the participation rates by self-report with the 150 are okay and maybe getting better, but on the strengthening front, it's much less, and particularly so in women. So the adage that going from zero or nothing to something is the biggest reduction in risk is true also of strength training. So that's the baseline buy-in or caveat. So what is best? Well, first let's participate and do the guidelines, and that's the best thing you could do. Once you've arrived at, like, I need to do this, and there's a way I can do it, then really it's about, and there's a sort of an old school, I wouldn't say old school, but there's definitely a lift heavy mantra that just refuses to die. And I think when you go to sort of the original literature on this, it came from a guy named Thomas DeLorme. He was a captain in the Army, and in 1946, he wrote a paper, Heavy Resistance Exercises. And he was a bodybuilder, and he was talking about rehabbing soldiers that had, basically come back from World War II, and what would we do? And he did start a sort of a renaissance around the understanding of what heavy weights could do, but heavy weights are sufficient to make your muscles bigger and make you stronger, but they're not necessary to do that. So you can do it with lighter weights. And it's definitely not our idea, but I think that we've galvanized people's understanding, at least around, lighter weights are fine too. So, lift to the point where things become difficult, or where you would say, check, that's about an 8 to 9 out of 10 on an effort scale. And if that's with a lighter weight or a heavier weight, I don't think it matters as much unless you're training for a specific event. And a lot of people, talk about bones, and I'm like, they respond just as well to, lighter or heavier weights. The power aspect comes in moving something fairly quickly. And, necessarily to do that, it tends to be a lighter weight that you're going to do it with for most people. So, you can imagine, you take a broomstick and you can slam it over your head. And now everybody goes, but I watch people do that with heavy weights. And I'm like, that takes a lot of practice, and not for the faint of heart, and definitely not for the uninitiated. So, it's develop the strength base first, then sort of dip into the lighter weights, but with a little bit more focus on velocity. And then as your skill begins to develop and you've got what we call motor pattern, then you begin to, up the weight a little bit. But it's about moving something quickly. And even if it's your own body weight to start with, that's a pretty important skill to develop. But strength comes first. It's the base, and then the power comes generally second.
Okay. So this is fascinating to me that you're saying to build sort of this strength training or resistance training is moving against a load that is atypical for your normal activities. Is that right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be necessarily heavy weights in a gym. There are other ways. I'm curious to know, what are some of those other ways? When I think about strength training versus aerobic exercise, they seem like different things, but are there aerobic exercises that are also building strength, right? Like, I'm thinking about, I play sand volleyball, right? So there's an explosive jump and an explosive hit. Does that count? Like, because you're only doing that in little movements with your own body weight, right? Like, what counts as strength training for people?
Yeah, I mean, there's a what we call generally it's the strength endurance continuum. So down one end is the big heavy weight that you can only lift once, what we call your one repetition max, and that would
Hmm.
be where power lifters live. And then we move into sort of 8 to 10 repetitions, and that's where bodybuilders quote unquote live. And then when we get into higher repetitions, and I'm talking about 20 repetitions before, let's say you're curling a weight, and everybody sort of experience this phenomenon where your muscles kind of shake, and that's sort of the top end where I would say that's still resistive in nature. But to your point, as you say, you can get into some activities where they're more explosive, and maybe it's your own body weight as you jump up for like a spike in volleyball, for example. But that's what we call a plyometric or a loaded jump maneuver. And you're just trying to displace your own body weight vertically, and you have to crouch down and load up and generate strength actually quite quickly. And that's resistive in nature, but the skill that you develop in doing that is more power related than it is strength related. And it's definitely can't do too many jumps, so it's not endurance either. Running and cycling, yeah, that's you can do that, thousands of repetitions. So that's endurance, pure and simple.
Except
But
for
there
maybe
are some,
sprinting,
yeah,
right?
so
Sprinting.
the sprinting aspect, now you get down into how long can things happen before you fatigue, and if it's a 100-meter all out sprint, then that's an activity that sort of gets more into the resistive aspect of things. But if you can imagine, just about everybody's done a push up. And I said, okay, good push up form. So straight body, no sagging, bending, or anything else like that. How many times can do a push up and, get your chest down to the floor and push yourself up and, 10, 12, 15? Well, then you're pushing your own body weight, and you could do the same thing you could imagine doing. And everybody hates them. Everybody hates push-ups too, because they were used as a punishment. That's why everybody
We
hates
have
it.
bad associations with them.
Yeah, exactly. Drop and give me 20, right?
Yeah.
Imagine pulling yourself up in a flexed arm hang, as a chin up, right? Which is a very difficult maneuver to do. And there's some people who couldn't do it even once, but that's a pulling maneuver, again, where you're pulling your own body weight. Now, you do need a bar, you need something to test, but you can imagine that if you can't do a chin up, being able to do one and then gradually two and then three and four, that's a pretty tough strength maneuver that people could train without any weights at all, and it's just your own body weight. And you could do the same thing with a squatting maneuver where you just you folded your hands and you squatted down and you stood back up, and do that as many times. And now when you get strong enough, all of those things become quite easy, and that's when I would say that you need to think about incorporating a heavier weight that's not just your body weight, and so maybe a gym is the place for you to go next.
Okay. So I know a lot of people, like you mentioned, the biggest obstacle is just to do any sort of activity. And
Yeah.
and trying to do strength activity is like, okay, many people don't like going to the gym, right? Can
Yes.
you can you say can you describe some of the optional activities that could count for some of this? Because you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, 2 times a week of strengthening activities. Maybe there's a minute category, but do things like pickleball, do things like soccer, do things like basketball, volleyball, do those count, or is it sort of like there's an asterisk there? They don't really
Yeah, I
count.
mean, I mean, I think the ethos of what I would say in terms of physical activity, pure and simple, and to differentiate physical activity like anything that we do that makes us physically active. And so, gardening is a physical activity, for example. But going for a ride, going for a run, playing soccer, playing pickleball, all great activities from a physical activity standpoint, but they develop more sort of cardiovascular strength. And then the pickleball, yeah, with the lunging, you've got a little bit of what we call plyometric, or sort of springy type exercises. The resistance comes from sort of purposeful engagement and things that are designed to really make you stronger, if you like. So there's got to be a movement of a load. It's got to be X number of repetitions, and close to the time where, I don't need complete fatigue. In other words, if you're, doing a push-up, it's like, "Oh, I don't need that." But I mean, you've got maybe one or two push-ups in the tank, then you can stop there
Okay.
and you've done the resistive work. But the activities that you describe are more what I would call on the endurance side of things. So you
Okay.
have to engage in something that is purposeful, and when you're doing it for the purposes of developing strength, then we call it exercise. Or if you do go for a bike ride with the intention of, I'm doing this for my enjoyment, health, I guess,
Hmm.
but to try and get better, that's exercise. But you can be physically active and still be, great health, no problem. Some of the benefits on the resistance side require purposeful engagement in the activity, as opposed to just, oh, I'm going to go out and make myself stronger. You have to think a little, which is probably why a lot of people struggle with the concept, right? It's, when people say be more physically active, you can just go for a walk,
Hmm.
and everybody understands that. But being stronger requires some thought.
And there's something
Resistance
about,
bands are a great
resistance
one.
bands.
Sorry. So if you've
Yeah.
never seen these sorts of things, they have become much better in their design. They cost the sort of cheapest set and still good, maybe about $50 on Amazon. Order them to your home. There's hundreds of videos available, some that come with the bands, some that are on YouTube. You work against the resistance, so as you sort of curl it, you can feel the resistance, and those they're very effective. We just finished a big study using them in older people, and tremendous strength gains and functional gains for sure.
Okay. So we can't stay out of either the gym or doing intentional strength training. How about the volume or length of time? Like, is it is there is there a set minute marker? Like, are you talking about 60 minutes in the gym at least twice a week?
Yeah, this is another area where, in speaking with people who work in, sort of the resistance and I'll call it public health, and trying to describe, people struggle, because 150 minutes, everybody, they've got a watch, they can look at that, and everybody now generally has a device that they can, track their heart rate on, or a ring or something like that.
Right.
Um, so that's much more easily quantified. I think that time is not necessarily what I would ask people to do. Although if you were to give sort of a minimum, I'd say it should take you about 30 minutes and 30 minutes. So it's only about an hour of engagement per week. And we do now have sort of dose response data on reduction in chronic disease risks. So observational data only to this point. And 60 minutes to sort of 90 minutes is that threshold where you get this, sort of the nadir and the curves beginning to kind of flatten out. And it's not that you can't do more if you enjoy it, and plenty of people do. But from a health standpoint, at least the common chronic health issues, cardiovascular disease, cancer risk, type 2 diabetes, usually the big three, they tend to bottom out at around 60 to 90 minutes. And so, not that you shouldn't do more or you couldn't do more, but that's from a health benefit where things end
Okay.
pretty
So
quickly. So
you really get the most bang for your buck if you're doing at least two 30-minute sessions per week of
I
strength
think
training.
so. I think that
Yeah.
that's a good starting point, and I like to sort of make the point to people that sometimes it doesn't seem like much, quote unquote, is that you can go for a walk for hours, and I mean, what you'd really like to do is be doing both, right? The 150 plus the 2 days a week, and everybody goes, I don't have the time for that, and I'm like,
Right.
I get it, but I think the true answer is you probably do have some of the time, or maybe even all of the time, but you have to prioritize it to make it an activity that you want to engage in. And then,
Hmm.
yeah, I get it. It's not always my favorite thing to do, and I love exercise,
Yeah.
but
I,
I
I
get it.
think I think both of those are real obstacles for people, right? Taking the time, everyone's busy. And then finding something that you can do long term. So that's kind of where I think people struggle. And for the people who don't like the gym, I think it's sort of how can you figure out ways to strength train without doing that? Is that possible? I'm also curious to know if you're sort of just get it out of the way. If you want to do 3 sets of 10 for, a deadlift and a push exercise and a pull exercise and be done. Yeah. Does that kind of count, or do you need to go in there in 30 minutes and you need to make sure you're doing stuff the whole time?
No. It's actually, somebody asked me. I was scrolling through some DMs on Instagram just the other day, and somebody said, like, I'm a shift worker, and like I still want to hit my goals, but literally I have about 30 minutes, and that includes like getting into the gym and doing my workout, then showering and getting ready and going back to work. And I was like, okay, so like 30 minutes is everything. So pretty much you're in the gym for about 15 to 20 minutes. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, they said, what would you do? And I said, well, so 60% of your muscle is below your belt, right? So you got to work your legs, right? If you can only do it twice a week, you kind of got to hit your legs. But so a squatting maneuver is like something where you've got your weight or your own body weight and then squatting down. A deadlift maneuver where you're pulling something off the floor. And so for what we call your posterior chain, your hamstrings, your glutes, and everything like that. I said then a push. It can either be a push while you're seated, a push off your chest, or better to work it both ways. And so you get incline, like what we call an incline bench. So you're working your shoulders as well. And then a pull. And I said, do them what we call supersets. So you go from one to the other, and then you rest, and then one to the other. And it's hard work. I get it. And
you keep your heart rate up. You get a cardio workout at the same time. Yeah.
It's
like, why not?
Save time. They said, I said, you know what? They go, that sounds tough. I'm like, it is. It is, but you asked about something you could, hit all the main big muscle groups, do it in a short period of time, and get a pretty effective workout. And I said, if you did that, and to cut the time down, get the weight to where that sort of 8th or 9th or 10th rep was really tough to do. I don't need fatigue, but hit that and 2 sets of 10 or something for each exercise. I think you could get it all done, maybe even in 10 to 12 minutes. So they were like, okay, well, I'll try it. I said, well, start lighter, work your way up and all these things. But
how about
check with your physician first before you begin an exercise.
You don't want to be liable for somebody getting hurt.
That's why I'm like, well, this is advice. Do with it what you will. But I think you could get it done pretty quickly.
Okay, so a lot of folks may go to the gym and do this all at once. I'm also curious, many people have equipment at home. Is it the same? So let's just say that we're talking about volume. Let's say that somebody had the choice between doing 3 sets of 10 reps of like you said, a sort of a full body, lower body, like a squat or a deadlift, a pull, like say pull-ups, push-ups, bench press, something like that. Now, if you split that and you did 2 sessions per week where you did the minimum of those sort of that volume, right? 30 reps of each of those 3 movements, would that be preferable to, let's say, every day you do 1 set of each rep? You hear what I'm saying? Like, could you I'm about to have lunch. Let me just go in and do a quick 5 minutes here and I'll be back to lunch.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, we and a few others have tried to sort of unravel these things. I think one of the things before I answer your question is to freely admit that the aerobic exercise community has a lot more data, and they've been collecting data for a lot longer on the impact of that type of exercise prescription for health, to the extent that the resistance crew is sort of like, we're just about catching up, and we're still years off. For me to be able to say definitively this is better for you or anything else like that, or what is better, There's a school of thought out there that they called the concept, they use a tagline called greasing the groove. And they're big believers in sort of, you're just, you're greasing the groove, like every day you're doing something. And even if it's, not even that tiring, you kind of, you do a set of curls or something. It tends to be small muscle group exercises, or you do like a front shoulder raise or a side shoulder raise or something. And so you have one day a week where you do your heavy work and you go in the gym, and then you have a few other days a week where you just do one set of 10 and then you back off, and then maybe later in the day you do another set of 10. I'm not sure that we have a lot of data for me to be able to say which is more effective, but we certainly know that, 2 or 3 days a week, the difference, 2 is slightly better than 1. 3 is incrementally better than 2. More than 3, I think that the effects begin to taper off. So 0, not good. 1, better than 0. 2, better than 1. 3, maybe marginally better than 2. And then and it's sort of like the same concept, volume wise, for endurance work or sprints or anything else like that. There's a volume beyond which the response begins to plateau. And I think it's probably between 2 and 3 and 3 and 4 workouts a week. And then it becomes, what can you handle? What can your joints withstand? Generally, when you're younger, they can handle a whole lot more than you can when you're my age. And what are your goals? Like, why are you doing this? Is it for health? Or is it for, I want to, get better because I'm doing this event or something like that? And that's easy to understand. If you're going to run a 5K, then you prepare to run 5 kilometers. But resistance training events outside of, how much can I lift at one time, things like CrossFit competitions, high rocks, these sorts of things are, they're more recent types of events that require a specific type of training. And, most people challenge themselves with resistance within themselves. It's just like, this is how strong I want to get.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds like there is some flexibility in terms of how you go about it, but you're saying
Absolutely.
it's pretty critical to do this for a lot of reasons, for not just our own muscle mass and our ability to do movements as we age, but you're saying for cardiovascular health, for other sort of blood glucose regulation, so preventing your risk of diabetes, things like that, these other non-communicable diseases. So
Yep.
I'm hearing it. I think we all need to hear it. It's important to do that, not just the physical activity, but the strength training. So you mentioned that protein, when we started this conversation, you sort of, and maybe many others, sort of put a little bit too much emphasis on protein itself for muscle. Let's still talk about it. It's something
Sure.
a lot of people care about, especially
Yeah.
in the US. I mean, it's all about protein. And
Yeah.
so can you sort of shed some light? Is hitting the RDA for protein sufficient, for the average person? Do you think the RDA is all we need, or is there more to it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start out the conversation by saying, I've been doing this for about 30 odd years, and I started in protein. That was, when Mark Tronopolsky and I first got together, we were, it was about protein because protein supported muscle and everything else like that. And then I went away from it and did a little bit of work on other substrates, but came back to it. And I guess I've always kind of enjoyed the interaction between exercise and nutrition. So probably have a foot in kind of both camps, and wasn't trained in nutrition, so have gradually learned over the years, sort of nutrition wise, what is important, and we've done a fair bit of research in this area. So I think when you go back to the whole premise of the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA, I could walk away if we just called it something different. Instead of it's recommended and it's all you're allowed to eat. If it was the minimum dietary intake, the MDI, I doubt we'd even be having a conversation. I'd be like, yeah, it's cool. That's the minimum. which is really what I think it defines. And, I'm not alone in that, but a lot of people are still wrapped up in the concept of the elegant experiments that are, nitrogen balance experiments, which I'll explain a little bit, and the care that was taken and everything else like that. So I think what we've come to my conclusion is at this point is that the RDA will probably never change. At least I had that as a career ambition at one point. I'm going to change the RDA, and now I'm sort of getting close to this end of my career. I'm like, that's not going to change, whatever. So let's educate people on what it really means. And the method we use is nitrogen balance. And what that really means is the balance of protein in your body. So protein's coming in, and then if we measure everything protein that's coming out, so we collect all your urine, all your feces, all your sweat, we collect your nail trimmings, we collect your skin, and people have done this.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, I think I want to say that I'm one of the few people who's done like the full nitrogen balance. We did sweat washdowns, we did fecal collections and everything.
Wow.
And super fun experiments. So,
I'm sure.
and the way the experiment should work is that, once you sort of hit your requirement for protein, you should just sort of level off in terms of, you shouldn't keep, retaining protein in your body. But the nitrogen balance experiments always show the more protein that you ingest, nitrogen balance just keeps going up and up and up. And that shouldn't happen. So, my observation is that the fundamental premise of the method is actually flawed. It's wrong. And yet we still keep using it. And so it's sort of like, the experiments were so detailed, and there's some romantic notion that because they were meticulously conducted, they yield a valid outcome. And the whole model of the way the thing works it's just not right. Anyway, so I digress. Get to the RDA. It's the minimum protein intake to keep yourself in pretty much zero nitrogen balance. So protein going in is matching protein going out. So it meets your needs. But I think you mentioned you were speaking with Don Layman. As Don Layman would point out, is that our need for nitrogen is not easily defined, even by the method that they have to, ultimately to define it. And then B, it doesn't deal in optimal needs for amino acids that have specific roles. And those change with different disease states. They change with aging. They change with, temperature. They change with lots of different conditions but it's much harder to define an optimum intake, as you would know, than to define what we need to stop. Vitamin C is a great example, like scurvy, right? That's, that was easy to understand. And yet when we found out, smokers needed more, and actually it was beneficial to sort of intake this amount of vitamin C. So we changed the requirement for vitamin C. That adjustment hasn't been made for protein.
So if there's so much consensus in the expert scientific community on this topic, what is preventing the RDA from either changing, or what it sounds like you would be fine with is just changing the name, minimum dietary intake? So what is it like? How could we do that? Who's in charge of this?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people who sit on, dietary guidelines committees, and there was actually a recent review published on this, and, looking for evidence in a systematic way. And I think when you define, the variables that will form the search of the literature to look for I would agree with the outcome of the review, which there is no evidence. But I think when you sort of stitch a few observations together and you think critically about, the method that we currently use, you're forced to conclude that we don't have enough data from the current method, or I think there are better methods, but they haven't been widely accepted. So what you call consensus is probably, it doesn't exist, which is why there's been no change. I
Okay.
do think, and you could probably address this better than I could too, is that, as you know, it's cheaper, much cheaper to purchase starches and carbohydrates and oils and so fats than it is to purchase and give people protein. So in food insecure regions or food insecure spots in even developed nations, protein is the tightly regulated food macro because it's expensive. So I want
Yeah.
to say that there's maybe a little bit of economic pressure to sort of keep the minimum where it's at.
Yeah. Well, you and I are working on this paper, which I'll send you an update on soon, where we're going to look at globally what is the prevalence of inadequate protein intake. And I think we do want to think about this sort of prevalence of overt, inadequacy where we're not meeting this minimum versus the optimal amount. I think both of those are important. Can we talk a little bit more for people to understand? I think the RDA is something like for the average populations, it's like, is it 0.8 grams per
zero point
kilogram
0.8
of body
grams
weight?
per kilo body weight per day.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
to do the translation, it's about 0.35 grams per pound per
Yeah.
day.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so for an average person, maybe 165 pounds, that comes out to what, like 55
Yeah,
grams, something around there?
it's about, yeah, about 60 grams.
60 grams. So it's not a lot.
Yeah. No.
I easily eat 60 grams in a single meal. So not hard for me. So let's talk about optimal. So I know that there are a lot of debates on the margins around, elite athletes, bodybuilders, all of that. But I'm thinking more for the general population, and then we can get into maybe particular life stages. Do you feel like there's a clear sort of range or target, what you would sort of like to see for optimal health rather than just this minimum amount?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at all of the studies, including the meta-analysis of all the nitrogen balance data, which has been reanalyzed with different models, more the ones like I've suggested, that instead of believing that it's a linear response, which is how it's modeled in the main meta-analysis that forms the RDA, is that what's called a breakpoint. So effectively looking at the plateauing. So in the reanalysis, the requirement was, instead of 0.8, it was 1 gram per kilo per day. So closer to about 0.4 grams per pound. So up a little bit, but I mean, that's still a 33% increase, right? So not trivial. I think that other methods called indicator amino acid oxidation, I won't get into it, but recommend closer to about 1 to 1.2. So that's the type of range where I think, most people should at least try to aim. The point that's made then sort of in reply is, well, everybody's eating that, and the truth is that everybody's not, and particularly older people who probably have requirements or at least optimal level intakes, which are closer to almost 1.6, which is twice
Mm-hmm.
the RDA.
Well,
And
also,
then,
Stu,
yeah,
what's really important is that the U.S. is not sort of out there in isolation where we just have the RDA and we're the only ones who use it. I
oh
mean,
yeah,
globally, it has big implications. And so, yes, you could say, okay, most people, and you're talking about groups that don't do this even in the U.S., but you say most people get that 1.2 grams per kilogram. We don't really need to worry about it, right? But in reality, there are a lot of populations around the world that don't get that. There are normative guidance, if you think about the Eat Lancet Commission and others, where they're just recommending hitting that sort of minimum, right? If you even get to that, especially with really low animal source foods in the diet. So I do think it has big implications to actually say, yeah, it's not really just 0.8 grams per kilogram that's optimal. We really should be aiming for 1.2. Can we talk about these life stages? So you're talking about older adulthood. Can we talk about any others, maybe pregnancy or any other life stages where requirements increase?
I mean, pregnancy is definitely a life stage where protein requirements go up. In fact, even the people who, cling vehemently to the RDA would agree with that, and then lactation as well. So, growth in children is definitely underpinned by different protein requirements. And I mean, I think, and again, you could speak better to this with your knowledge of sort of global intakes. We know that growth stunting is directly related to both energy and protein intake. And that's where, we've sort of come up with these minimum types of intakes that are, it definitely promotes growth in kids. And I think, people would say, well, that's when your protein requirements are greatest because you're growing. And I said, well, in the other sense that, towards the other end of the curve, when you're aging, it's actually you're preventing shrinking, if you like, is you're losing that muscle mass. It's definitely not as rapid as growth, but it is an insipid process that is compounded by reducing dietary intakes and reducing, because older people tend to underconsume protein. If they make an adjustment, they eat less. What they actually then sort of target in terms of the foods are actually more sweet carbohydrate based foods as opposed to protein foods. And a lot of that may be cultural and learning. And, I work hard to, when March rolls around in Nutrition Month, we have a community access exercise center with, 500 seniors coming in, and we have like it's okay to eat an egg day, because their generation, was whipped into, eggs were bad.
Don't have
for you.
cholesterol.
Yeah,
Dietary like, cholesterol is bad.
That's gonna kill you, right? And I'm like, still affordable, pretty tasty, I think, pretty versatile breakfast food where most older people really go low on their protein intake, and nutrients that you can't get in other packages. So, and I know I have no sponsorship with the Egg Marketing Board or anything.
The Egg Board is sponsoring this podcast.
Yeah,
right?
No, but it's it's been a vilified food. But I mean, a lot of older people, it's like, well, I got to avoid meat. I've got to do this, and this, and not to dismiss the potential health benefits of consuming plant-based proteins, but you have to be pretty judicious about how you pick those. And a lot of people just aren't as well versed in sort of how to cook and prepare and everything else like that, plant-based foods.
Yeah, let's talk about that. First, though, I want to just maybe close the loop on this life stage discussion. So we have these population groups. We're talking about older adults, 65 years and older, pregnant women, lactating women, and then maybe even young children, infants and young children, especially during that under 5 years of age. 6 to 23 months is that rapid growth and development.
Yeah.
Do you have numbers? So you said 1.2 grams per kilogram for the general population. Do you have targets for these different life stages?
Yeah, I'm not sure I could give you those exact targets, but I mean, I think that the argument has been from groups that use the indicator amino acid oxidation method. And a lot of those have come out of Canada, to be fair, because the method was invented by a guy named Paul Penchurch and his colleague Ron Ball. So now it's been carried on by Rajvel Elongo, who's a faculty member at the University of British Columbia, and Glenda Cordy Martin down at Sick Kids. And Raja tends to deal in the pediatric populations, and he would make the argument that the current recommendations are on the low side for pediatric populations. And Glenda would make the argument that the estimates for older people are also on the low side as well. So, again, I think that it's moving away from defining minimum intakes that, sort of cut right to the, this is the absolute need, and trying to move into more defining optimal intakes. So again, it's about maybe getting consensus and agreement that the methods that these folks use are valid methods. And there are still one or two people out there who push back against those as methods.
Well, Stu, you're still working. I think you could be the person to spearhead this OPI, the optimal protein intake. I think it can be named.
Intake, yeah.
You can you can sort of create the name, and I think it's
Yeah.
a good idea. So I support you on that.
It's a great notion. The point I would make is that, as I said, it's an intrinsically much more difficult problem to define optimal as opposed to minimal.
Yeah.
And so, minimum is sort of like we could probably track that with a few biomarkers, and we could look at muscle and a few other things if we had the longer term experiments. But optimal, is like, okay, we've met the minimum and now sort of getting it up to tweaking those levels. And so most athletes' approaches to that is just to say, oh, the hell with, the minimum for sure, but I'm going to go to this intake, and they're consuming, 2.2 or 2.4 or even more. And I think that that's kind of over the top. It's way more than they need, or even that they're optimally needing. But,
Hmm.
that's been the approach, is just to sort of saturate the system just in case. And,
Yeah.
I'm
I
not,
think
I'm not a huge fan of that either.
Yeah, I think it gets into this issue that there are often trade-offs, especially if you think about what is the purpose. And I think about other nutrients like iron, for example. You don't want to be low in iron, and you don't necessarily want too much iron. Like you don't want to have a bunch of heme iron if
Right.
you're right. So I think there's also that sort of trade-off. Are you looking at overall strength, power, athletic performance as your only thing you care about, or do you care about chronic disease risk as well? And there's some other factors. So, um, you mentioned plant-based proteins, and I think
Mhm.
this is really a hot topic today. People care about the environment. A lot of people are going more plant-based. You have people who are fully vegan. Um, what would you say to this discussion where, of course, I think there's a general consensus that, certain plant sources, they usually are limited in a certain essential amino acid. Soy is typically an exception where it's pretty high quality, but generally grains, you pair them with legumes, right? What would you say about that in terms of, do you need to do these sort of pairings? Do you try to do that at the same meal? Is it okay to do it just within one day? How would you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, my stance on, plant-based, I think if you'd have got me on the show 30 years ago, assuming podcasts existed that long ago, I just said for sure, based on what we know from, protein digestibility, corrected amino acid scores, and now DIAS, so the digestible indispensable amino acid score. So scoring patterns, plant-based proteins are inferior, in quotation marks, to animal-based proteins. And I still think that that's a truism. Now, fast forward to today, and I think that gap is a little closer physiologically than we thought. I might suggest that if you're on an entirely vegan or plant-based diet, that it's about maybe a 10 to 20% bump over an animal or omnivorous diet, animal-based protein consuming diet. That being said, I think that there are a few more options for plant-based these days than there were 30 years ago, for sure. At the same time, the pairing issue to move to regions of the world, everybody seems to have figured out that the grain and legume are, are,
Hmm.
are better together. And the only way is that fascinates me, how in the Caribbean, it's red beans and rice. In Latin America, it's black beans and corn. And, in Asia, it's lentils or tofu, soy and rice.
Right.
And I say this to my students. I'm like, isn't that amazing? And they just sort of glaze over. And I'm like, well, I think it's amazing. And that can only mean that there's some evolutionary pressure to force that to happen.
Right.
Right. I mean, there's a survival advantage to eating that way. So everybody who was just a rice eater, they probably died when there was a shortage, or everybody who was a bean eater couldn't eat enough beans, because everybody goes, you can live on beans, and I'm like, you
I think
can.
they were kicked out of the tribe for farting too
Yeah,
much.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's so yeah. To your point, right? I said, but that's a modernism in an abundant food environment. Like legumes were usually the rate determining component of most people's diet. There was lots of rice, but there weren't as many legumes. So
Yeah.
I think for optimal outcomes, even though it's probably a nudge, you should be getting those together in one meal. And that's the way they're served. And, there are some people who say, oh, well, it can be sort of disparate. And I agree that in a food abundant environment, you could probably, that would be fine. Although I don't think that it's optimal to come back to using that phrase. But I'm a little less worried about, the difference between plant and animal than I used to be. But again, recognizing that if people were to make the switch or to begin to eat more plant-based protein, particularly older people, my advice is I just hope that you're as physically active as possible, because that's going to help you hang on to muscle,
Mm.
a lot more than the protein intake will. But you have to be judicious about how you pick those proteins. So, and I still think people who talk about this and they go, "Oh, it's easy," and I'm like, it's easy for you because you have knowledge,
You have a
you
PhD in
have
nutrition science.
education,
Yeah.
and you have training, and this is how you cook every day. So they say, oh, well, if you can afford steak, you can afford, you know, you know, tofu, you can afford seitan, you can afford all of these great sources of, plant source proteins. And I'm like, in my city, in Hamilton, Ontario, where I live in West End, Hamilton, no problem. Lots of highly educated, high socioeconomic status go, you know, 3 miles to Northeast End, Hamilton. And, a lot of people, much lower socioeconomic status, lower educational status, higher risks of, smoking, you name it, every chronic health condition. And there's no tofu in the grocery store. There's no seitan in the grocery store. Tins of beans maybe, but and the food literacy of those folks and the disposable food income they have, you're talking about things that there's no way they would have a concept of, and they can't afford steak. They can
Yeah.
afford hamburger, and they've got 3 kids. So,
Yeah.
and so I just need to put it in context of everybody says how easy it is. And I'm like, it's easy for, there's a little bit, and though I hate to mention it, but a little bit of white privilege too. There's a lot of, sort of people that I look at who look a lot like me and you, with a
Hmm.
lot of advantages that a lot of other people in other ethnic groups and socioeconomic classes just do not have. And so, I don't want to be glib about it's so easy to get, because I think for some people it's just a food literacy issue that's tough.
Yeah.
So whereas, your own work would point out, the food modeling would say actually it might be better to sprinkle in some animal proteins because there's some other critical nutrients that are harder
Yeah.
to get, or if
And
not
it's,
impossible, maybe.
yeah. And especially in these populations where there really is not access to diverse foods, and the animal source food consumption is so low that it does expose people to even not being able to meet the minimum probably intake of protein. I've heard something, I won't say who said this, but you and I both know them. I heard something where it's like every plant food out there has all of the essential amino acids. They're all there, right?
They
And
are.
I say to myself, I'm like, yes, of course, but they're not all in the same quantities, right? And that's the
Yeah.
issue, right? It's like
Yeah.
you still have limiting amino acids, and
Yep.
if you're not very intentional and you don't combine these different sources that provide those, there's going to be at least suboptimal sort of muscle growth and different outcomes. So I fully agree. I think at the same time, we don't need to be going carnivore. That's pretty pretty obvious. You highlighted that really the resistance strength training is what's critical.
Yeah.
Um, I am curious to know though. We have talked about some people going up to like 2 or 2.5 grams per kilogram.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there concerns with that much protein? And I think there's we get into this discussion of longevity. There probably are some diverging views on how much protein is optimal for longevity.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the old school arguments, just to bring them up, because you can't talk about protein and not talk about people saying, "Oh, it's going to cause your kidneys to fail." I think we can check that one off. Like, I've looked and reviewed the literature on this pretty regularly, and it's about a 50 to 60-year-old hypothesis that's out there, and yet to find the smoking gun on that. And even in studies where people have been fed different levels of protein intake, there's no observable adverse effect on kidney function. So let's cross that one off. Making your bones soft, I think that one's also not true, so long as you're getting adequate vitamin D and calcium. So some good nutrient dense foods.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more recent kid on the block is that higher protein intakes are adversely affecting longevity. And a lot of people point out, and it's true, this is in animal, preclinical studies and everything, but people point to some human observational data and say, look here, I think it's really difficult to tease out the specific effects of protein per se from other components that are in the foods, even with all of the, so-called, this was controlled for. That's a mathematical elimination and the biology is still present. But, suspending my disbelief of some of that data, I will say that there is maybe some cause for concern with these higher intakes. My experience, because of the world I live in, is most of the people consuming those are athletes. And, if you're really active, you're go, and you're training 4 or 5 days a week, which some of these folks are, it's probably not a risk because you've got this sort of, sync where muscles sort of say, give me all this stuff. Like I'm churning through these substrates, no problem.
They're not your average American just kind of standing in front of the computer for 8 hours a day.
Yeah. If you're not as active and you're eating those really high protein intakes, I think at some point I might think that it may not be the best for you in the long term.
So what about numbers? Do you think that it's relatively safe for the average person to aim for 1.4 or 1.6 grams per kilogram? Do you think that's a safe target for longevity?
I think it's a sane middle, I'll call it.
Okay.
Which is
the Canadian
the RDA
middle.
it's very Canadian. Hopefully not upsetting too many people. And, if I do, I'm sorry, right? The RDA would be the bottom. 2.2, I think, is, more than most people, unless you're highly active, would need or optimally would benefit from. But that's sort of, 1.4, 1.6, I think is a safe middle. I think you're not really exposing yourself to intakes that would be, have adverse consequences. And I think you're covering probably, if not, 100%, definitely 95 to 99% of your bases in terms of protein intake.
Okay. That's a good middle ground. I'm also curious on this topic of plant versus animal protein. Do you have any views on the proportion of these in terms of how does that affect our sort of overall health? Like going more plant-based, going more animal-based, keeping it a mix? Where would you sort of land on that and the evidence?
Well, the disclosure is I'm a dyed-in-the-wool omnivore. There's lots of plant-based proteins that I like. I think if you looked at my dietary intake, and it's not like I assess it, but just off the cuff, it's probably about 50-50 or 60-40, maybe a little bit more plant than animal-based proteins. I try to eat more fish because I have the privilege of being able to afford fish. So, frankly, and I try to eat a little bit less red meat than I used to. Definitely processed red meat. But by no means is that a ratio that I would say is adverse or there's bad effects or anything. And I think pointing to even some recent reanalysis of some NHANES data that we did, you end up, it's kind of a push in the end. Although I agree that there are some studies which would say plant-based protein is a better source of protein. I hasten always to point out in these observational studies that that's generally comparing the lowest plant-based consuming with the highest. And so it's either lowest, I'll say quartile, so the lowest 25% with the highest 25%, or it could be quintile, so the lowest 20, so, and the people who are in the middle which is where I like to be. I think they generally, the difference between them and the highest is it's imperceptible. It's definitely not statistically significant. And so, that's sort of where I fall. So the high versus low comparison is often the comparison that makes the headlines in the,
Hmm.
observational outcome trials. And I'm not sure there's an optimal ratio, but of course there are arguments to be made for one or the other, again, to strike that boring middle ground.
Well, and also with these observational studies, there are attempts to adjust for known confounders, so variables
Right.
that sort of get in the way of the relationship, right, or explain that. And I think it's also possible of this sort of healthy user bias to some extent, where these people are, who are eating according to more guidelines, whatnot, maybe doing more healthy behaviors, right? Not
Yeah.
smoking, drinking, exercise, all those
Yeah.
things. And I think some of those are adjusted for, but you can't really account for them all in these models. And so there's probably some residual confounding that explains some of that. But what you're sort of
Yeah.
saying is it's okay to have a mix of plant and animal source protein for a lot of reasons. It's going to help you cover your essential amino acids. It's going to, help you have a balance in general. The more diverse your diet, the more likely you're to have the right amounts of things and not too much
Yeah.
of things. So I think that
Yeah.
makes sense. I have one final question I'd love to know about. If people are listening to this, and, a lot of older adults care about probably their muscle health because that's where you have to try to hold on to it. What would be one thing, if you could just tell people one thing they should do differently for their muscle health and older adults, what would it be?
Well, if you're not engaging in something that maintains your strength, so intentionally, going and doing something that makes you stronger or helps you preserve your strength or preserve an activity that you want to do, and they're generally strength related, um, then you should start doing it. And so it's like, as I often point out, people say it's too late for me. It's never too late. And we have data from people in their 10th decade of life. So nonagenarians in their 90s get stronger. It might be just getting up and out of a chair a few times, but it has effects. And so, if you're not doing that, I would do it. And, from a dietary standpoint, if you're on the low end of the protein intake, try and climb closer to at least 1.2.
Yeah. Okay. Well said. I fully agree. Dr. Stuart Phillips, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ty. I appreciate it.